Queen Nzinga was born into a world where power was often defined by violence, and the balance of empires was dictated by the wielding of military strength and political cunning. She was born in the early 1580s in the Kingdom of Ndongo, a region that today comprises parts of modern-day Angola. From her earliest years, Nzinga's life was shaped by the turbulent politics of Central Africa and the encroaching colonial ambitions of European powers. Her father, King Ngolambandi, ruled Ndongo, and she was the daughter of a royal bloodline that carried the legacy of centuries-old resistance against outside invaders. At the heart of the kingdom's struggle was the Portuguese Empire, whose forces had already established a strong presence along the coast. The Portuguese had long sought control over the interior, driven by the desire to exploit both the land's natural wealth and its people for the transatlantic slave trade. They wanted more than just trade routes. They sought dominion, and Ndongo, with its strategic location, was seen as a critical prize. The kingdom had already been in conflict with the Portuguese for many years, as the empire's soldiers tried to force their way deeper into the interior, securing control over territories and enslaving the people who lived there. Nzinga was raised in this cauldron of conflict, and early on, she demonstrated a keen sense of leadership and tactical awareness. But it was her intelligence and diplomatic prowess that would define her reign and her lasting impact on African and colonial history. The Portuguese did not simply meet resistance. They encountered a ruler who knew how to play the political game as well as the battlefield one. When Nzinga's brother, King Bandi, died, the Portuguese saw an opportunity. They sought to install a puppet king who would bend to their will, someone they could control. But this underestimated Nzinga. When her brother's death threw the throne into question, Nzinga's leadership skills were thrust into the spotlight. She was not just a sister to a king, but a powerful, shrewd tactician in her own right, with a vision for Ndongo's future that did not include Portuguese dominance. She seized the throne for herself, asserting her authority and making her intentions clear. Ndongo would not submit to foreign rule. This act of defiance would set the stage for her conflict with the Portuguese, a war that would span decades and reshape the history of Central Africa. It was not only about the military engagements that followed, but also the political maneuvering, the delicate alliances, and the resilience that Nzinga would display throughout her life. What the Portuguese underestimated was not just her military skills, but the sheer force of what she would bring to the battlefield, and how she would galvanize her people to fight back with a level of unity and resolve they had not anticipated. At first, Nzinga's approach to the Portuguese was not just one of confrontation. She knew the power of diplomacy as well as war, and so, when she first met with the Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, she came prepared not just for negotiation, but for a battle of minds. In a legendary moment, Nzinga entered the Portuguese camp for a peace negotiation, only to find that the Portuguese had set up a chair for her. It was a deliberate insult, a subtle way of demonstrating their belief in her inferiority. Without missing a beat, Nzinga ordered one of her servants to kneel and serve as a footstool for her as she sat down, symbolizing her unwillingness to be subjugated by the Portuguese. This clever move not only embarrassed the Portuguese but set the tone for her diplomatic dealings with them, a subtle but powerful statement that the balance of power was shifting. Though the negotiations ultimately failed, Nzinga's determination only grew stronger. Over the years that followed, she waged a relentless war against the Portuguese forces in Ndongo. But Nzinga did not simply rely on her own military forces. She sought out strategic alliances, recognizing the importance of unity in the face of a common enemy. In a stunning move, she forged an alliance with the Mbangala, a fierce and warlike group that had been previously used by the Portuguese as mercenaries. By aligning herself with the Mbangala, Nzinga ensured that her forces would be bolstered by highly skilled warriors who were familiar with Portuguese tactics and fighting styles. This alliance marked a shift in the dynamics of the conflict, as Nzinga's forces, once outnumbered and under-equipped, now had the support of one of the most feared warrior groups in Africa. The early years of Nzinga's reign were marked by a series of brutal military campaigns. The Portuguese sought to push deeper into Ndongo's territory, capturing towns and fortresses, but Nzinga's forces fought back fiercely, often outmaneuvering their more technologically advanced foes. With the help of the Mbangala, Nzinga took advantage of the terrain, leading her troops in guerrilla-style warfare that harried the Portuguese at every turn. But it wasn't just her military tactics that made her such a formidable adversary. It was her leadership, the way she inspired loyalty in her followers, even as the odds seemed to mount against them. Nzinga was a master of psychological warfare as much as she was of battle tactics. Her strategic use of propaganda, diplomacy, and alliances were as powerful as her armies in the field. She understood the value of symbolic victories, whether through diplomatic maneuvers, clever uses of propaganda, or bold military victories, and she used these to not only strengthen her kingdom's position, but also to inspire those who stood with her. Her resilience became a beacon for many, a signal that African kingdoms did not have to bow to the whims of European colonizers. Throughout the course of the conflict, Nzinga faced immense challenges. The Portuguese were relentless, and despite her best efforts, the kingdom of Ndongo was often under siege. Yet she never yielded. In times of great hardship, Nzinga demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to adapt, to shift strategies, and to learn from every setback. She became not only a symbol of resistance, but also a source of hope for other African kingdoms that were facing similar threats from European imperialism. Nzinga's story is not just one of military might, however. It is a tale of political acumen, leadership, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. As she fought for the survival of her kingdom, Nzinga understood that resistance was not just about taking up arms. It was about preserving culture, identity, and independence in the face of a foreign power that sought to erase all of that. Her legacy, built on defiance and courage, reverberated far beyond the borders of Ndongo. Even as the Portuguese sought to impose their control, they could not erase Nzinga's influence or her role in shaping the history of the continent. What Nzinga fought for, what she symbolized, became a rallying cry for generations to come, a testament to the unyielding spirit of African resistance to colonial rule. Her life stands as a reminder that history is often written not just by the victors, but by those who refuse to be silenced. Nzinga's legacy, enduring and powerful, transcends the confines of her time, continuing to inspire those who struggle for freedom and self-determination in the face of oppression. Queen Nzinga's reign was not defined solely by her military campaigns, but also by her deft understanding of the complex political dynamics that shaped her world. After the Portuguese had made it clear that they intended to bring the kingdom of Ndongo into their fold, by force if necessary, Nzinga was left with no choice but to continue the struggle for independence. Yet, her actions during this period would lay the groundwork for a series of maneuvers that would prove just as crucial to her survival and success as any battle she fought. While many would have resorted to desperate measures or drawn-out wars of attrition, Nzinga took a different approach. She understood that the power of diplomacy and strategic alliances could be just as powerful as her armies on the battlefield. In her early years as queen, Nzinga was determined not only to protect the integrity of her kingdom, but to position herself as a leader capable of rallying diverse forces against a common enemy. She had already demonstrated her sharp political acumen during the infamous encounter with the Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, where she had forced the Europeans into an embarrassing compromise by making a symbolic gesture of defiance. Yet, she was far from impulsive or reactive. Nzinga knew that this was only the beginning, and she needed a broader, more sustainable strategy to resist the Portuguese colonial machine. The first move in her long-term strategy was to establish a series of key alliances. These alliances, however, would not be with just any group. They had to be with those who not only shared her goal of resisting Portuguese imperialism, but also had the strength, influence, and resources to challenge the Europeans on the battlefield and beyond. Nzinga began reaching out to other African kingdoms and peoples who had also suffered under European colonial expansion, particularly those who had previously been at odds with Portuguese influence. One of the most crucial alliances Nzinga made was with the Kingdom of Matamba, a powerful neighbor to Ndongo. Matamba had long been embroiled in conflicts with the Portuguese, and their shared experiences made them natural allies. Nzinga negotiated a strategic partnership with the Queen of Matamba, gaining vital support in terms of military resources and tactical knowledge. This alliance allowed Nzinga to secure a stronger front against the Portuguese and to introduce new tactics and strategies that would catch the European forces off guard. With this newfound military strength, Nzinga was able to shift the balance of power in her favor. Yet, diplomacy was not just about forming alliances. Nzinga also engaged in an ongoing battle to shift the perceptions of her people and the surrounding kingdoms about her role as a queen. In many ways, her leadership had to overcome not only foreign invaders, but also internal challenges. Nzinga, as a woman in a predominantly patriarchal society, was constantly under scrutiny. Her decision to take the throne after her brother's death had already been seen by many as a bold and controversial move. To solidify her power and ensure the loyalty of her subjects, she had to prove herself not just as a queen, but as a capable ruler. This meant managing the internal politics of her court, forging relationships with her nobles, and ensuring that her military leadership was respected by both her people and her allies. Nzinga's leadership style was a reflection of her understanding that power was not just about military might, but also about ensuring the cohesion of the society she ruled. She was a pragmatist and recognized that in order to maintain control, she had to govern in a way that balanced the needs of her people with the external threats they faced. As the war against the Portuguese continued to intensify, Nzinga faced enormous pressures, both from within and outside her kingdom. But her ability to navigate these pressures with a sharp mind and steady hand would become one of her defining characteristics. By this point, the war had shifted to a new stage. The Portuguese had consolidated their forces and were determined to crush the resistance of Ndongo once and for all. Their military superiority, including advanced weaponry and access to naval power, presented a significant challenge to Nzinga's forces. But rather than being daunted, Nzinga adapted her tactics. She began to focus on guerrilla warfare, taking advantage of the terrain and the knowledge of her local allies. Her forces used surprise raids, ambushes, and hit-and-run tactics to outmaneuver the Portuguese in ways that their more conventional military strategies couldn't counter. These tactics allowed her to harass the Portuguese and disrupt their supply lines, causing them to waste valuable resources while simultaneously strengthening the resolve of her own forces. Despite these victories, Nzinga was far from naive. She knew that a protracted war of attrition would eventually wear her down, especially as the Portuguese increased their military presence in the region. She also understood that the Portuguese had a vast network of resources at their disposal, resources that could eventually tip the balance in their favor. It was at this juncture that Nzinga's diplomatic expertise would prove invaluable once again. Rather than focusing solely on military engagements, she turned her attention to diplomatic strategies that could undermine the Portuguese position in Africa. This included using her influence to cultivate relations with other European powers, particularly the Dutch, who were in competition with the Portuguese for dominance in the region. The Dutch, who had been pushing against Portuguese power in the Atlantic and beyond, saw Nzinga as a potential ally. They were keen to weaken the Portuguese presence in Africa and saw her struggle as an opportunity to further their own interests. Nzinga, ever astute, saw the value in allying with the Dutch. Not only did it provide her with access to arms, military support, and trade goods, but also created a new power dynamic that further isolated the Portuguese. In forging this alliance, Nzinga not only gained immediate military advantages, but she also delivered a significant blow to Portuguese imperial ambitions. The Dutch were happy to provide Nzinga with military resources, including gunpowder, firearms, and soldiers, which would help her mount more effective resistance against the Portuguese. It was this alliance that allowed Nzinga to reassert herself on the battlefield, securing crucial victories and forcing the Portuguese into a defensive position. However, even as Nzinga's forces began to gain the upper hand, the struggle was far from over. The Portuguese were not willing to simply relinquish their ambitions in Angola, and they continued to seek ways to undermine Nzinga's position. The fight for Ndongo was as much about political survival as it was about military victory, and Nzinga's ability to maintain alliances, secure resources, and navigate the shifting tides of diplomacy would ultimately determine the fate of her kingdom. Nzinga's ability to adapt and innovate in the face of adversity was a hallmark of her reign. As the war dragged on, she employed increasingly sophisticated tactics, blending traditional African warfare with modern European strategies. She adapted her forces to the changing nature of the conflict, always staying one step ahead of her enemies. She understood that survival was not guaranteed by any one strategy alone. Rather, it was about using every tool at her disposal: diplomacy, alliances, military strategy, and leadership to keep her kingdom intact and protect her people. Through it all, Nzinga maintained her resolve. Even in the darkest moments of the war, when the Portuguese seemed poised to crush her forces, she never lost sight of her ultimate goal: the preservation of her kingdom's sovereignty and the protection of her people from foreign domination. Nzinga's reign would come to symbolize not just military resistance, but a defiant assertion of African independence in the face of European colonialism. Her story, marked by her extraordinary resilience and strategic brilliance, continues to inspire those who fight for freedom and justice in the face of overwhelming odds. As the war against the Portuguese dragged on, Queen Nzinga's position was more precarious than ever. The Portuguese, having underestimated her resilience and tactical ingenuity, were forced to recalibrate their approach to the conflict. Though their military might and colonial ambitions were formidable, the fierce resistance from Nzinga and her people began to take a toll. The back and forth of skirmishes and large-scale battles had created a prolonged stalemate, with neither side able to decisively claim victory. Yet, it was clear that Nzinga's ability to hold her ground was a testament to her leadership, while the Portuguese found themselves increasingly stretched thin, both in terms of resources and morale. However, victory on the battlefield was not enough to secure lasting sovereignty. Nzinga had fought hard to defend the independence of her kingdom, but the ongoing conflict with the Portuguese also created fissures in the region. As the Portuguese doubled down on their efforts to conquer Ndongo, they sought to forge new alliances, hoping to divide and conquer the African kingdoms in order to weaken Nzinga's position. Realizing the dire situation, Nzinga shifted her focus to consolidating her power and further fortifying her alliances, not just with the Dutch, but with neighboring African kingdoms as well. One of the most pressing concerns for Nzinga during this period was the question of succession. The war had left Ndongo's leadership vulnerable, and though Nzinga had proven herself as a fierce and capable queen, the future of her kingdom hung in the balance. There were rivals within the court who viewed her leadership with skepticism. Her rise to the throne had been anything but conventional, and there were those who still believed that a male heir should rule the kingdom. Some of her advisors and generals were quietly plotting to undermine her authority, hoping to wrestle control away from her in the event that the kingdom fell to the Portuguese. Nzinga, ever the astute strategist, knew that the stability of her reign depended on her ability to manage these internal challenges. As a female monarch, she faced unique obstacles, both from external colonial forces and internal factions who questioned her rule. Yet, rather than retreating into isolation or submitting to the pressures of her court, Nzinga worked tirelessly to solidify her power and secure her kingdom's future. She knew that any sign of weakness would be exploited by her enemies, and she would not allow Ndongo to fall to the colonial ambitions of the Portuguese. Nzinga took several decisive steps to fortify her position. She worked to strengthen her relationships with the people of Ndongo, ensuring their loyalty through a series of political and social reforms. She understood that a kingdom could not be ruled through sheer force alone. It required the support and trust of its citizens. Nzinga also turned her attention to bolstering the military, ensuring that her forces were not only well-equipped, but also disciplined and unified. She had already gained a reputation as a brilliant military leader, and her ability to adapt to the changing dynamics of warfare ensured that her soldiers remained formidable despite the odds. While these internal measures were important, Nzinga was also mindful of the external forces that threatened her kingdom's survival. The Portuguese were relentless, and though they had been unable to crush her resistance, their persistence was undeterred. They had established fortified positions along the coast and continued to push deeper into Ndongo territory, seeking to disrupt her supply lines and force her to surrender. The Portuguese even began to offer rewards for information on Nzinga's whereabouts and military movements, hoping to undermine her position through espionage and covert operations. In the face of such threats, Nzinga relied on her network of alliances to bolster her defenses. The Dutch, who had long been Nzinga's allies in the conflict, continued to provide vital military support, delivering arms and resources that allowed her forces to continue their resistance. The Dutch were keen to ensure that Portuguese power in Africa remained in check, and their assistance proved invaluable in keeping Nzinga's forces well equipped. Nzinga also expanded her alliances with neighboring African kingdoms, recognizing that unity was the key to survival. By fostering a sense of solidarity among the various African states in the region, Nzinga sought to create a collective front against the Portuguese. But it wasn't just military alliances that Nzinga relied upon. She was also an expert at psychological warfare. She knew that the Portuguese were not just fighting a war on the battlefield. They were also fighting to maintain their dominance and control over the African continent. Nzinga, in turn, waged a war of attrition, gradually chipping away at the morale of the Portuguese forces. Her use of propaganda and symbolic acts of defiance were integral to this strategy. She ensured that every victory, no matter how small, was magnified and celebrated, not only within her kingdom but across the surrounding regions. Each success was framed as a blow to the Portuguese colonial project, a reminder that resistance was not only possible, but it was flourishing in Ndongo. One of Nzinga's most remarkable strategies during this period was her ability to sustain the morale of her people, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. While the Portuguese continued their attempts to encircle her kingdom and cut off vital resources, Nzinga's people remained steadfast in their loyalty to her. She used every opportunity to reinforce their sense of purpose, reminding them that their struggle was not just for the survival of Ndongo, but for the preservation of their way of life and their culture. Nzinga was not just a military leader. She was a symbol of hope, resilience, and pride for her people. Yet, despite all of her efforts, the tide of the war seemed to be turning against her. The Portuguese had begun to employ increasingly brutal tactics, including scorched earth policies and the mass enslavement of local populations. These actions not only weakened Nzinga's forces, but also deepened the suffering of the people in the surrounding regions. The Portuguese were willing to do whatever it took to break the will of the African resistance, and Nzinga was forced to confront the reality that, at times, the war seemed hopeless. The constant pressure, the toll of battle, and the suffering of her people weighed heavily on her. Still, Nzinga never wavered. She understood that the struggle for independence was not just about military victory, but about the long-term vision of a free Africa. Even as the Portuguese forces tightened their grip on the region, Nzinga continued to fight, not out of a desire for personal glory, but out of a deep commitment to the sovereignty of her kingdom and the future of her people. The war had become more than just a battle for land. It was a struggle for the very identity of her people, a battle to preserve their dignity and independence in the face of foreign subjugation. Nzinga's commitment to the cause was unwavering, but she was also pragmatic. She understood that she could not continue the fight alone and that the path to victory would require more than just military victories. It would require a careful balance of diplomacy, military strategy, and, above all, a vision for the future. As the war entered its final stages, Nzinga would need to make some difficult decisions. She knew that the Portuguese would not give up easily, but she also knew that their empire was stretched thin and their ability to maintain control over distant colonies was weakening. In time, she believed victory would come, not just through force of arms, but through the resilience and unity of her people and the strength of their collective will to resist colonial oppression. As the struggle between Queen Nzinga and the Portuguese dragged on, the war evolved from a series of isolated skirmishes to a full-scale battle for the survival of her kingdom. Despite their military might and the technological advantages of their European weaponry, the Portuguese found themselves in a quagmire. The unexpected resilience of Nzinga's forces, coupled with her astute use of diplomacy and alliances, meant that the Portuguese could no longer consider the conquest of Ndongo a simple matter. Yet, despite her strategic brilliance, Nzinga's position was far from secure. The tides of war were shifting, and every victory seemed to be followed by a harsh reprisal. But she was resolute, knowing that the future of her people and her kingdom rested in the balance. By this point in the conflict, Nzinga had demonstrated the depth of her leadership and tactical ingenuity. The Portuguese, who had initially dismissed her as an inconvenience, now viewed her as a formidable adversary. The small kingdom of Ndongo had transformed into a symbol of resistance, an obstacle in the path of European imperialism. But even as the war seemed to drag on in a stalemate, Nzinga understood the importance of strategy. She recognized that the conflict could not simply be won through military means alone, no matter how skilled her forces had become in fighting asymmetrical warfare. Nzinga's ability to read the long-term dynamics of the situation was one of her greatest strengths. She knew that the Portuguese had vast resources at their disposal, and their hold over coastal regions was firm. The Portuguese had established a network of forts and trading posts that stretched from the coast into the interior, creating a chokehold on the kingdom's ability to trade, receive resources, and maintain economic stability. The situation had become even more dire as the Portuguese adopted increasingly aggressive tactics, such as raids on villages and the destruction of crops, which weakened the morale of her people and made it even harder to maintain the military campaign. One of Nzinga's key responses to the deteriorating situation was to reconsider her alliances. The Dutch, who had been providing military support to Ndongo in exchange for strategic advantages, were increasingly embroiled in their own conflicts with the Portuguese, particularly in the region of Angola. Though Nzinga had gained significant assistance from the Dutch, arms, troops, and naval support, this relationship had always been a pragmatic one. The Dutch were less concerned with the survival of Ndongo than with their own economic and imperial ambitions in the region. The alliance, though crucial, was not a guaranteed lifeline. Nzinga, however, had learned to adapt and was always prepared to shift her strategy when circumstances changed. She recognized that the Dutch, with their own self-interests, might not be enough to secure her kingdom's survival in the long run. As the war wore on, Nzinga began to seek new avenues of support, looking for ways to create a coalition of forces that could unite against the Portuguese in a more unified and sustained manner. She began to reach out to other African kingdoms who shared her goal of resisting Portuguese domination. In particular, Nzinga's diplomacy turned towards the Kingdom of Congo, which had its own history of conflict with the Portuguese. The King of Congo, who had once been an ally of the Portuguese, had fallen out of favor with them after a series of colonial abuses, and like Nzinga, he had begun to resist their interference in his kingdom. This strategic shift would prove to be crucial. Nzinga's diplomatic maneuvering allowed her to forge a broader resistance network, one that united not just Ndongo, but also several neighboring kingdoms. By creating a coalition of African powers, she was able to weaken the Portuguese position in the region. The alliance with Congo brought an additional force of troops and resources, which allowed Nzinga to regain the upper hand in several critical battles. The Portuguese, stretched thin by fighting on multiple fronts, were forced to reassess their strategy, unable to maintain their grip on the interior as they once had. Despite these successes, Nzinga's leadership remained under constant pressure. The constant warfare had exhausted her people, and with each battle, the toll on both the human and economic resources of Ndongo grew. While her military tactics had been remarkably effective, she knew that the longer the war dragged on, the more difficult it would be to maintain the strength and unity of her forces. The Portuguese, aware of this, sought to exploit these weaknesses, attempting to turn the people against Nzinga by offering amnesty to those who would defect from her cause. In the face of these tactics, Nzinga remained steadfast, determined not to let internal divisions tear her kingdom apart. To address the internal challenges to her rule, Nzinga embarked on a series of reforms aimed at consolidating power within her kingdom. She worked tirelessly to reinforce her position by centralizing authority and promoting unity among her people. She appointed loyal generals and advisors to key positions, ensuring that her court was filled with individuals who were fully committed to her cause. This effort to strengthen the internal structure of her kingdom was vital, as it allowed her to better manage the demands of war while also ensuring that dissent within the court was minimized. Nzinga also worked to maintain her strong rapport with her people, emphasizing the idea that their fight was not just for the survival of Ndongo, but for the broader resistance to colonial oppression. She understood that a battle for land and power could easily become a battle for hearts and minds, and so she made sure that her leadership was not just defined by military victories, but also by her commitment to her people's welfare. Her efforts to secure food and supplies for the population, even in the face of constant raids and blockades, helped to ensure that her people did not lose hope, even as the war raged on. But the greatest challenge Nzinga faced during this period was the growing pressure to secure a decisive victory. The Portuguese, despite their stretched resources, had managed to hold on to key coastal positions, and their forces continued to push inward, destabilizing the region. The Portuguese, with their superior naval power and access to international markets, were still a formidable force, and Nzinga knew that the longer the war continued, the harder it would be to sustain the fight. At the same time, Nzinga's personal struggle to maintain control over her kingdom was compounded by the fact that she was still viewed with suspicion by some of the more traditional elements of her society. As a woman in power, she was constantly reminded of the obstacles that came with being a female ruler in a patriarchal world. There were some who believed that a male heir should lead the kingdom, and these factions continually sought to undermine her authority. These internal power struggles, combined with the external pressures of the war, weighed heavily on Nzinga. Yet, she remained unyielding, determined not only to protect her kingdom, but to prove that a woman could rule as effectively as any man. Despite the setbacks and challenges, Nzinga's resolve never faltered. Her belief in the survival of her kingdom and the protection of her people kept her fighting even when the odds seemed insurmountable. But she was also a realist. She knew that the war could not be won with military force alone. To secure her kingdom's survival, Nzinga would have to make difficult choices, balancing the demands of diplomacy, military strategy, and governance. In the coming months, as the war entered a new phase, Nzinga would be forced to navigate even more complex political terrain, all while keeping her eyes firmly fixed on the ultimate goal, the preservation of her people's freedom and independence. The conflict between Queen Nzinga and the Portuguese had reached a pivotal point. Years of resistance had worn both sides down, but the war was far from over. The Portuguese, despite their superior weaponry and naval power, had been unable to break the will of Nzinga and her people. They had underestimated her resolve and her ability to adapt to changing circumstances. But as the years passed, it became clear that a decisive resolution to the conflict was needed. Nzinga's kingdom, Ndongo, was facing a crossroads. The kingdom's resources were stretched thin, and the toll on its people had been severe. Despite her leadership and the unwavering loyalty of her forces, the challenge of continuing the fight seemed overwhelming. Nzinga, however, was a leader forged in adversity, and she was never one to back down from a challenge. Over the years, she had developed a profound understanding of the political and military landscape of the region. She had learned not only how to defend her kingdom, but also how to manipulate the various factions and players that shaped the conflict. Her alliances, once limited to the Dutch and a few African kingdoms, had grown more complex. Nzinga now sought to expand her diplomatic network, knowing that any hope of defeating the Portuguese would require more than just military victories. It would require a coalition of forces that could challenge the Portuguese on multiple fronts. One of Nzinga's most significant diplomatic moves during this time was her renewed outreach to the Kingdom of Congo. The Congo had long been a thorn in the side of the Portuguese, and although they had once been allies, the relationship had soured after years of Portuguese exploitation and colonialism. Nzinga, understanding the power of a united front, sought to rekindle the relationship with the Congo and create a shared resistance against the Portuguese. Her diplomatic skill, which had been tested on numerous occasions, was now at the forefront of her strategy. Nzinga understood the fragility of any alliance, particularly when dealing with multiple parties whose interests did not always align. The Kingdom of Congo, though eager to resist Portuguese interference, had its own internal challenges and political divisions. Nzinga, with her characteristic political savvy, worked tirelessly to mediate these differences, ensuring that her alliance with Congo was not only secure but strengthened over time. She used her reputation as a determined and capable leader to reassure the Congo rulers that her cause was aligned with their own. Through these delicate negotiations, she was able to secure additional support for her forces, including troops and resources that were crucial in the ongoing struggle against the Portuguese. But Nzinga's diplomatic acumen extended beyond African kingdoms. As the war escalated, she found herself increasingly entangled in a European power struggle in the region. The Dutch, who had been consistent supporters of Nzinga's resistance, were embroiled in their own battle for dominance in the Atlantic and African trade routes. Though their primary interest was in undermining Portuguese power, their motivations were not entirely aligned with Nzinga's long-term goals. The Dutch, ever pragmatic, had little interest in the fate of Ndongo beyond its strategic value in their broader ambitions. Despite this, Nzinga was able to navigate the complexities of this relationship with remarkable skill. She ensured that the Dutch remained committed to her cause by offering them trade agreements and concessions that would benefit their colonial interests, all while securing military support for her war effort. The Dutch, motivated by self-interest, provided critical supplies, including firearms and gunpowder, which allowed Nzinga's forces to continue fighting. But Nzinga was never fully reliant on the Dutch. She knew that any alliance with European powers had its limits, and she kept her options open, always seeking to ensure that her kingdom's survival would never be entirely dependent on the whims of foreign powers. The arrival of the Dutch brought with it new tactics and technologies that would play a pivotal role in the next phase of the conflict. With their naval superiority, the Dutch were able to disrupt the Portuguese supply lines along the coast, preventing reinforcements and supplies from reaching Portuguese forces in the interior. This, in turn, allowed Nzinga's forces to launch a series of successful raids on Portuguese settlements and outposts. These raids, though small in scale, were crucial in maintaining the pressure on the Portuguese, preventing them from consolidating their control over the region. Nzinga's forces, once again strengthened by Dutch support, began to regain ground. With their increased firepower and tactical expertise, they were able to harry Portuguese forces and push them back from several key positions. But despite these successes, Nzinga knew that the Portuguese would not easily relinquish control over the territory. The Portuguese were determined to hold on to the economic and strategic advantages that the region offered, and they were prepared to escalate the conflict if necessary. As the war continued, Nzinga faced mounting challenges on multiple fronts. The Portuguese, recognizing that they could not defeat her through direct confrontation alone, began to employ more insidious tactics. They sought to undermine Nzinga's rule by targeting her support base. They spread rumors, created divisions within her court, and attempted to sow distrust among her allies. The Portuguese were also adept at using diplomacy to their advantage, attempting to peel away some of Nzinga's allies by offering them favorable terms in exchange for their loyalty. These efforts created a precarious situation for Nzinga, who knew that maintaining the unity of her coalition was essential to the survival of her kingdom. Despite the Portuguese attempts to destabilize her rule, Nzinga's leadership remained unshaken. Her ability to navigate the political landscape, both within her own kingdom and beyond, ensured that she retained the loyalty of her allies. She was a master of persuasion and negotiation, using both force and diplomacy to achieve her goals. Her skill in maintaining unity within her ranks was key to her continued success. However, As the years passed, Nzinga's position became increasingly tenuous. The war had taken its toll on her kingdom, and resources were running low. Her people, though fiercely loyal, were beginning to feel the strain of constant warfare. The Portuguese, despite their setbacks, were far from defeated, and their control over the coast remained firm. Nzinga knew that time was running out for her kingdom. She needed a decisive victory, one that would either force the Portuguese to the negotiating table or drive them out of the region entirely. In response to this, Nzinga ordered a series of well-coordinated strikes against Portuguese strongholds. These attacks were designed to destabilize the Portuguese presence in the region and force them into a defensive position. Nzinga's forces, emboldened by their previous successes and their renewed alliances, launched a series of raids on Portuguese settlements along the coast. These strikes, though not catastrophic in scale, were highly effective in disrupting Portuguese operations and weakening their ability to maintain control. But as the conflict wore on, Nzinga realized that the war could not be won through military means alone. The Portuguese, despite their losses, still held a significant advantage in terms of naval power and access to international trade routes. Nzinga needed a more sustainable solution to end the conflict and secure her kingdom's future. It was during this period of reflection that she began to consider the possibility of negotiating with the Portuguese. She understood that diplomacy, though often a last resort, could offer a path to peace and a way to preserve the sovereignty of her kingdom. Nzinga, having fought so fiercely for her kingdom's survival, was not one to settle for a weak peace. She knew that any negotiation would have to secure Ndongo's independence, and that the Portuguese could not be allowed to dictate terms. Her resolve was absolute. She would negotiate from a position of strength, having already demonstrated her ability to resist the Portuguese for years. This would be no simple concession. It would be a testament to her leadership and the determination of her people. As she prepared for this final stage of the conflict, Nzinga understood that the future of her kingdom, and perhaps the future of African resistance to European colonialism, depended on the outcome of the talks. The war had not been in vain, but its final resolution was yet to be determined. As Queen Nzinga prepared for the final phase of her struggle against the Portuguese, the burden of leadership weighed heavily on her shoulders. The years of relentless warfare, the destruction, and the sacrifice of her people had taken their toll. Her kingdom, once vibrant and proud, had been ravaged by the conflict. Yet despite the hardships, she remained resolute in her commitment to the survival of Ndongo and the preservation of her people's sovereignty. Though she had fought fiercely with military strategies, guerrilla tactics, and diplomatic maneuvering, the realization began to dawn that a new kind of strategy might be necessary. One that involved the art of negotiation, the delicate balancing of power, and a redefinition of the terms of resistance. Nzinga was no stranger to the intricacies of diplomacy. She had deftly used alliances with the Dutch and the Kingdom of Congo, and had made shrewd decisions that allowed her to maintain her leadership against the Portuguese for years. But even she recognized that the war had reached a point where an outright victory might not be possible without an unspeakable cost to her people. The Portuguese, despite their weaknesses, still held a powerful foothold along the coast. They controlled the trade routes, had fortified strongholds, and, most importantly, they maintained a naval advantage that allowed them to resupply and reinforce their positions with relative ease. It was clear that as long as the Portuguese controlled the sea, their ability to disrupt her kingdom would remain constant. For Nzinga, the prospect of continuing the fight indefinitely was unsustainable. While she had always been willing to sacrifice for her people, she was no longer willing to see her kingdom destroyed for the sake of pride or revenge. Her initial resolve to push back against the Portuguese had been driven by a desire to protect her people, but she now understood that the protection of her people could also mean finding a path to peace, one that could ensure Ndongo's survival without continuing to sacrifice lives. She began to consider the possibility of negotiating a peace settlement with the Portuguese. It was a delicate proposition. The Portuguese had never been willing to treat her as an equal, and their imperial ambitions had made them dismissive of African rulers, especially women. They had believed that they could force her into submission, and they had underestimated her resolve at every turn. But now, as the war had dragged on, their resources were stretched thin, and they had suffered enough setbacks to begin to question the sustainability of their occupation. Nzinga, keenly aware of the shifting dynamics, knew that her position was as much a matter of perception as it was one of military strength. She had successfully prolonged the war for years, but the longer it dragged on, the more costly it became. She knew that peace would not come without concessions, but the question was how much she was willing to give up in exchange for a guarantee of her kingdom's survival. As she weighed her options, Nzinga began to focus on the psychological aspects of negotiation. She understood the importance of being able to negotiate from a position of strength, but she also knew that the very act of sitting down to talk could shift the balance of power. Her refusal to capitulate to the Portuguese had already earned her a reputation as a determined and capable ruler, one who would not bend easily. Now, by opening the door to diplomacy, she could leverage that reputation to her advantage. Nzinga's first step was to send a message to the Portuguese. She sought to communicate her willingness to negotiate, but only on her terms. She would not accept anything that undermined her authority or the sovereignty of Ndongo. In her letter, Nzinga made it clear that she was open to talks, but that the terms must reflect the reality on the ground. Ndongo, she asserted, was not a conquered territory. It was a kingdom that had fought and bled for its independence. Any peace agreement, therefore, must respect the kingdom's autonomy and ensure that Portuguese interference would be minimized. For the Portuguese, the prospect of negotiation was both a sign of their failure and an opportunity to solidify their hold over the region. They had been engaged in the conflict for years and had already suffered considerable losses, both in terms of lives and resources. However, their colonial ambitions in Africa had not faltered, and they were determined to retain control over the trade routes and the wealth that came with the exploitation of the land and its people. At the same time, they were well aware that Nzinga's resistance had become a symbol of defiance, not just in Ndongo, but across Africa. To defeat her, they had to secure a peace settlement that would neutralize her leadership while maintaining their foothold in the region. Negotiations between Nzinga and the Portuguese began under the shadow of years of hostility. The initial meetings were fraught with tension, as both sides understood that they were negotiating from positions shaped by conflict. Nzinga's diplomatic prowess, however, was immediately apparent. She had spent years outmaneuvering the Portuguese through military tactics and alliances, and now she applied the same strategy to the negotiation table. She made no concessions on key issues, such as the sovereignty of her kingdom and the ability to govern without foreign interference. At the same time, she was not unreasonable. She acknowledged the Portuguese presence on the coast and recognized the need for some form of trade agreement. But she made it clear that this would not come at the expense of Ndongo's autonomy. The negotiations were long and arduous, with both sides testing each other's resolve. The Portuguese tried to use their superior military position to pressure Nzinga into making concessions, but she held firm. She knew that the Portuguese, despite their naval advantage, were exhausted by years of war. Their resources were dwindling, and their hold on the region was more tenuous than it had ever been. It became clear that a negotiated settlement might be the best option for both sides, though neither was willing to give an inch without extracting something in return. Over the course of several months, the talks slowly progressed. Nzinga's negotiations were guided by a single principle: the survival of Ndongo and the preservation of her people's freedom. She refused to accept terms that would leave her kingdom vulnerable to future Portuguese aggression or exploitation. The Portuguese, for their part, sought to secure economic and strategic benefits, including continued access to trade routes and the ability to maintain a military presence along the coast. The turning point in the negotiations came when Nzinga, ever the master tactician, offered a compromise that would allow the Portuguese to retain a limited presence along the coast, but with strict conditions. In return, she demanded the cessation of Portuguese expansion into the interior and the formal recognition of Ndongo's sovereignty. Nzinga also insisted that the Portuguese cease their practice of enslavement and exploitation of her people, a demand that was met with considerable resistance, but which she was unwilling to drop. For Nzinga, this was not just a matter of military strategy, it was a matter of justice and the dignity of her people. In the end, after much negotiation and pressure from both sides, the Portuguese reluctantly agreed to terms that allowed Nzinga to maintain control over her kingdom. The treaty, though imperfect, represented a victory for her and for the people of Ndongo. While the Portuguese retained some coastal holdings, they were no longer able to expand their control further into the interior. Nzinga had secured her kingdom's survival and ensured that her people would no longer be subjected to the brutal exploitation of European colonialism. The peace settlement marked a significant turning point in the history of resistance against colonialism in Africa. Nzinga's ability to negotiate a peace that preserved her kingdom's sovereignty and dignity was a testament to her leadership and political acumen. While the war had taken its toll, and the Portuguese remained a presence in the region, Nzinga's triumph in securing peace showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, it was possible for African rulers to assert their authority and protect their people's freedom. The legacy of her victory reverberated far beyond the borders of Ndongo, inspiring future generations to resist colonial domination and fight for their independence. In the wake of the peace settlement, Queen Nzinga's leadership was tested in new and profound ways. While the negotiations had preserved the sovereignty of Ndongo, the war had left deep scars on her kingdom, and the future was far from certain. The peace agreement, though a significant achievement, was not a full resolution to the challenges that Ndongo faced. The Portuguese, though constrained in their expansion, still held a strategic presence along the coast, and their influence remained a persistent undercurrent in the region's politics. Moreover, Nzinga's kingdom had suffered immense losses, not only in terms of lives, but also in resources, infrastructure, and the morale of the people. The path to recovery would not be an easy one, and Nzinga's ability to rebuild her kingdom would be as important as her ability to lead in wartime. Nzinga, ever the pragmatist, knew that peace was not the end of her struggle, but rather the beginning of a new phase of governance. She had not only fought to preserve the independence of her kingdom, but now had to ensure its survival in the aftermath of such devastation. The challenges she faced were monumental. The land had been scarred by years of battle, villages had been razed, and the population had been decimated by war, disease, and famine. Many of her people had been displaced, and the once thriving economy of Ndongo was now in ruins. Yet, despite these overwhelming obstacles, Nzinga remained resolute. She knew that to restore her kingdom, she would need to engage in a process of healing, rebuilding, and consolidation. The first step in her recovery plan was to stabilize the internal governance of Ndongo. The war had not only depleted the kingdom's resources, but had also created political fractures within the royal court. Despite her successes, Nzinga's reign had not been without opposition. There were factions within the nobility who had not supported her leadership, especially those who had questioned her legitimacy as a female ruler. Some were reluctant to accept a woman at the helm of the kingdom, believing that a man should hold the throne. These internal divisions had been kept at bay during the war, but with peace now in place, Nzinga needed to secure her position and solidify her control. Nzinga's leadership was marked by a blend of diplomacy and assertiveness. She understood the need to unite her kingdom after years of internal strife and external conflict. To this end, she began by reaching out to the noble families and powerful factions within her court. She worked tirelessly to build coalitions and foster loyalty, ensuring that those who had once been her adversaries now stood by her side. Nzinga used a mix of political strategy, patronage, and diplomacy to bring together a fractured court. She also made it clear that loyalty to the kingdom and to her leadership was paramount. Those who could not accept her rule were given a choice: to fall in line with the new order or to face exile. This was not a time for indecision or division. Nzinga's leadership would be as firm in peace as it had been in war. Alongside her efforts to consolidate political power, Nzinga recognized the need for economic recovery. The war had severely disrupted trade and agriculture, both of which were essential to the kingdom's prosperity. Ndongo's once thriving agricultural sector had been devastated, and many of its people were struggling to rebuild their livelihoods. The Portuguese, despite the peace agreement, still controlled critical ports and trade routes, making it difficult for Nzinga's people to access essential goods and markets. Yet, Nzinga was no stranger to adversity, and she knew that recovery would require innovation and resilience. Nzinga turned to the rebuilding of local economies, focusing on small-scale farming and trade within the kingdom. She encouraged her people to return to the land and replant crops that had been destroyed during the war. While she could not immediately undo the damage done by the conflict, Nzinga pushed for a renewed focus on self-sufficiency. She also sought to reintegrate the displaced populations back into their communities, giving them the resources and support they needed to rebuild their homes and businesses. These efforts, though gradual, began to show results as the people of Ndongo worked to restore their agricultural and trade systems. Nzinga also recognized the importance of securing her kingdom's economic independence. To this end, she worked to strengthen alliances with other African kingdoms that were similarly threatened by Portuguese expansion. By creating a network of trade and mutual support, she hoped to reduce her kingdom's reliance on the Portuguese-controlled ports and establish alternative routes for commerce. This strategy would also serve to further isolate the Portuguese, weakening their grip on the region. However, the path to recovery was not without setbacks. Even with her political savvy and diplomatic efforts, Nzinga faced constant pressure from the Portuguese. They had not abandoned their colonial ambitions, and despite the peace agreement, they were still intent on controlling key coastal regions. The Portuguese maintained a strong naval presence, and their influence over the surrounding areas remained a constant threat. Nzinga knew that, while the war had ended, the Portuguese would not easily relinquish their imperial designs. She had to remain vigilant. One of the major challenges Nzinga faced in the post-war period was the question of external trade. The Portuguese, who controlled most of the coastal trade routes, had the ability to cut off Ndongo from crucial resources. While Nzinga worked to establish alternative trade networks, she knew that these efforts would take time and that the kingdom would need to rely on the Portuguese to some extent for its immediate survival. This created a delicate balancing act. Nzinga had to navigate the fragile peace with the Portuguese while maintaining her kingdom's independence and preparing for any future conflicts that might arise. Nzinga's diplomatic efforts continued to focus on securing her kingdom's interests, not just in terms of trade, but also in terms of military alliances. She knew that her kingdom would be vulnerable without strong regional allies. She reached out to neighboring kingdoms, particularly those in the Congo and Matamba regions, to build a collective defense against Portuguese encroachment. Nzinga understood that a united front would be key to deterring any future Portuguese aggression. Yet, despite her efforts to secure the future of Ndongo through diplomacy and alliances, Nzinga faced the inescapable reality of her age. The war had taken a toll on her health, and the demands of leadership were beginning to weigh heavily on her. Nzinga had led her kingdom through years of conflict, and while her resolve remained unbroken, the toll on her physical health was apparent. She had always been a fierce warrior and a shrewd strategist, but she was now beginning to face the consequences of a life spent in the service of her people. Despite these personal challenges, Nzinga remained committed to her role as a leader. She understood that the survival of her kingdom depended on her ability to guide it through this delicate period of reconstruction. Her legacy would be defined not just by her victories in war, but by her ability to navigate the complexities of peace and rebuild a kingdom torn by conflict. Nzinga's reign, marked by both war and peace, would come to symbolize the strength and resilience of the African spirit in the face of colonial oppression. In the years following the peace settlement, she worked tirelessly to rebuild her kingdom, ensuring that it remained independent and strong. Though the challenges were many, Nzinga's ability to overcome adversity and lead her people to recovery left a lasting imprint on history. The story of her leadership, her diplomacy, and her unwavering commitment to her people would inspire generations to come, reminding the world of the power of resilience and the enduring fight for freedom. In the years following the peace settlement, Nzinga's leadership faced yet another critical juncture. Her kingdom, though spared from total collapse, still found itself in a precarious position. The peace with the Portuguese, while preserving her kingdom's sovereignty, had not fully quelled the instability in the region. While Nzinga had managed to re-establish control over Ndongo, the surrounding territories remained fraught with tension and unrest. The Portuguese, though confined to their coastal territories, still exerted influence over the broader region, and their colonial ambitions remained a looming threat. In the face of this ongoing challenge, Nzinga realized that her work was far from over. Her kingdom, ravaged by years of war, was beginning to rebuild, but the scars of conflict were not easily healed. The population was diminished, its morale shaken. The land had been scarred by battle, and many of the structures that had once symbolized Ndongo's strength lay in ruins. Rebuilding would require not just physical resources, but a resurgence of the collective spirit that had once made Ndongo a proud and resilient kingdom. Nzinga knew that she would need to engage not only in governance, but in the restoration of her people's sense of unity, pride, and purpose. In this phase of her reign, Nzinga's leadership would undergo a transformation. She was no longer just a war leader defending her kingdom from external invaders. Now, she was a peacemaker, a restorer of her kingdom, and a symbol of endurance. Her first priority was to stabilize the kingdom's internal structure. While the nobles and military leaders had rallied behind her during the war, the peace brought with it new complexities. Her kingdom was still divided in some ways, with factionalism simmering beneath the surface. There were those who had once opposed her leadership, particularly the more conservative elements of the court, who had reluctantly accepted her rule during the war, but still questioned her legitimacy. Now, with the Portuguese temporarily neutralized, these factions would attempt to reassert their influence. Nzinga's ability to navigate the delicate politics of the court would be crucial in the coming years. Her experience as a strategist and diplomat, honed through years of warfare, now turned toward internal governance. She worked tirelessly to bring together the disparate factions of her kingdom, uniting them under the banner of shared prosperity. The focus of her rule shifted from defense against external threats to creating a cohesive, stable society. She sought to balance the needs of the nobility, the military, and the common people, ensuring that all groups felt invested in the kingdom's future. One of Nzinga's key strategies in this period was the reinvigoration of the military. While the war had been hard on her forces, she knew that a kingdom could never afford to be complacent. The Portuguese were not the only threat to Ndongo's sovereignty. Other African kingdoms, driven by their own interests and rivalries, could pose challenges. Nzinga, therefore, made it a priority to rebuild her military infrastructure. She reinforced the training of her soldiers, focusing not only on combat skills, but on discipline and unity. She also sought to integrate new military tactics, drawing on the lessons learned during the war. Her forces were no longer merely a defensive unit. They were being molded into a more versatile and capable force, one that could respond to any threat, be it internal or external. At the same time, Nzinga worked to stabilize the economy. The war had devastated the kingdom's agricultural output, and the trade routes that had once been vital to Ndongo's prosperity had been disrupted. Much of the kingdom's wealth had been spent on military endeavors, leaving the treasury depleted. To recover, Nzinga focused on rebuilding the agricultural sector. She encouraged the reclamation of land and the planting of crops that had been lost during the war. Nzinga also sought to revive trade, though this would prove to be a difficult task. The Portuguese, despite their diminished influence, still controlled important coastal ports, and their ability to control trade routes remained a challenge for Ndongo. Nzinga's solution was to seek out alternative trading partners. She looked to other African kingdoms, particularly those to the north and south, with which Ndongo had historical ties. She also sought alliances with the Dutch, whose military support had been instrumental during the war. Although the Dutch were primarily interested in undermining Portuguese influence in Africa for their own gain, their support was crucial for rebuilding Ndongo's economic capacity. Nzinga's diplomacy with the Dutch extended beyond military alliances to include economic agreements that allowed her to circumvent Portuguese control of the trade routes. In addition to her military and economic efforts, Nzinga also focused on the social and cultural healing of her kingdom. The war had left deep emotional and psychological scars, and Nzinga understood that recovery was not just about rebuilding infrastructure or restoring power. She needed to restore the spirit of her people. Nzinga had always been a symbol of resilience, but now, in the aftermath of the war, she sought to reinstate the sense of collective purpose that had unified her people during their resistance. She held public ceremonies and encouraged the rebuilding of communities, emphasizing the importance of unity and collective strength. Through her leadership, she worked to restore faith in the future of Ndongo, reminding her people of their shared history, their triumphs, and the enduring power of their culture. However, the road to recovery was not smooth. Nzinga faced new challenges, including a growing sense of discontent among certain factions of the population. While many had rallied behind her during the war, some of the more radical elements of the kingdom were beginning to question the terms of the peace settlement. The Portuguese, though restrained, still maintained a presence in the region, and some of Nzinga's people felt that she had compromised too much by negotiating with the colonial power. They wanted a more aggressive stance, a stronger repudiation of the Portuguese. These tensions brought new difficulties for Nzinga, as she sought to maintain the delicate balance of power and unity within the kingdom. Nzinga, ever the tactician, was careful in how she addressed these discontented factions. She understood that the wounds of war were still fresh and that her people were eager for a sense of justice and retribution. Yet, she also knew that the reality of Ndongo's survival lay in diplomacy, not in the continuation of conflict. She continued to maintain her firm stance against Portuguese control, but she also sought to reassure her people that peace was necessary for the long-term prosperity of the kingdom. Her leadership was marked by pragmatism, as she reminded her people that the war had already taken a heavy toll and the survival of Ndongo depended on the ability to rebuild, not on revenge. Despite these challenges, Nzinga's reign began to stabilize. The kingdom slowly began to recover, and the spirit of the people, once dulled by years of war, began to rekindle. The economic and military reforms she had enacted took root, and Ndongo began to regain its former strength. Nzinga's leadership continued to inspire her people, as she worked tirelessly to restore the dignity and sovereignty of her kingdom. She had fought for her kingdom's survival, and now she worked to ensure its future prosperity. As time passed, Nzinga's legacy began to take shape. Her name became synonymous with resistance and resilience, not just in Ndongo, but across Africa. She had successfully defended her kingdom against a powerful colonial force, and now she was rebuilding it into a thriving and independent state. Nzinga's reign would go down in history as one of the most remarkable examples of African resistance to European imperialism, a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, Nzinga's leadership in the aftermath of the war proved to be just as significant as her role in the conflict itself. She had not only defended her kingdom's sovereignty, but had also restored it to a place of strength, unity, and resilience. Though the peace with the Portuguese had been hard-won, it had paved the way for the renewal of Ndongo and the continued resistance against colonial forces in Africa. Nzinga's ability to navigate the complexities of peace, to heal the wounds of war, and to rebuild her kingdom ensured that her legacy would endure for generations.